Hi, I'm Chrissarandon, and welcome to Cooking by Heart. Where we revisit the vivid memories of the food we grew up with and the people and the stories attached to that time in our lives. Today, my special guest is Dr. Sara Seidelmann. I'm going to give you a relatively brief introduction of her accomplishments. If I read them all, I wouldn't have time for the podcast. She is a graduate of Cornell University, and she holds master's degrees in human nutrition and a PhD in nutritional biology from Columbia University. After completing her medical training at Case Western University, she was then accepted into the prestigious physician scientist training program at the Yale School of Medicine. She went on to the Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital, where her training and research was supported by the National Institutes of Health. Her research has focused on the complex interrelationship between genes, pathogens, nutrients, cardiovascular health, and aging, which is very applicable to our show. And her research has been published in top-tier medical journals. Her research has been incorporated into multiple clinical preventive health guidelines in the US and Europe, and her expertise has been the feature of over 600 worldwide news articles in, among other publications, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, Time, New York Times, The Guardian, too many others to mention. She's currently an assistant professor of clinical medicine at the Columbia University Medical Center. She is the mother of 4 children, and full disclosure, she is my primary care physician. So, Sara, welcome to Cooking by Heart.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. So we generally start the show with what I call provenance, which is where you're from. So tell me a little bit about where you were born, where you grew up.
Sure. So I was born in Princeton, New Jersey, but most of my growing up was in Greenwich, Connecticut, where I now live and practice.
Right.
And so this is a place where my father grew up, my grandparents lived. I have lots of aunts, uncles, cousins, family, friends who are like family here. And so that was a big draw. Yeah. This is home.
Exactly. Home. Tell me a little bit about mom and dad.
Mom and dad were high school sweethearts. They were from very different families. And so that informed me very much. So my father's family, as you could imagine, living in Greenwich was, a very affluent, old American family. And my mother came from a very poor background, I would say. Grew up with very little means. And so came from really different backgrounds.
They met in school?
They did. They actually met at boarding school. So my mother's mother was such a hard worker. Her parents were divorced when she was young. And my grandmother worked for the state of Connecticut. She worked 2 jobs to put her kids through school. And so my parents met when they were at boarding school in high school.
Tell me a little bit about home life, what it was like. What did your mom cook?
My mother did cook. So my mother was raised for part of the time in France. She lived in France as a young child. Her father fought in the war, and at the end of the war, he was in France, and he decided to teach there. So my mother's young life was in France. So there were parts of.
Do you know where?
All that I know is that it was the French countryside. The food was one thing, but, she was a young American girl in France in a French school system. And so she, just as a little child, she had memories of, they'd still hit you over the hand with a ruler, right. When you didn't speak French just perfect.
Right.
So, those were a lot of her memories. But of course, she took in a lot of the food culture. So, even as a little kid, I remember grating zucchini for a souffle, and souffle was going to be our dinner. Wow. But my mother had very kind of, I think of them as Danish. Her family originally was Danish, but had these sort of sensibilities of minimalism. So you might make the souffle, but you had one small slice, If we had a sandwich, it was going to be, one slice of something, or the driest peanut butter and jelly sandwich you could possibly imagine, because there was so little on it. We never had leftovers. So those were her kind of sensibilities. So she was very much in the kitchen, but it was not this overflowing of food.
Right. But it had a heavy French influence, obviously.
Yeah, at times it did. At times it could be somewhat decadent, in that way.
Really?
She would certainly spend hours to make one delicious meal that she liked.
Does anything stand out in terms of what the sort of standard fare was at home?
Well, things changed very much. So there was my early life as a child, and that was all about what was wholesome. So I think my mother was a bit ahead of her time in that sense.
Oh, really?
There was no white bread in my house. There was no candy in my house. A very, very few processed foods. That was hard as a kid growing up in elementary school, because all of the other kids had white bread and Coca-Cola in their lunch boxes. And honestly, I mean, I was a kid like every other kid, and I felt bad because the kids would make fun of me, say things like, "Oh, your mother must not like you very much. Did she throw your bread on the floor before she made that sandwich?" So, I had carrot sticks. Other kids had potato chips. So I was offered carrot sticks or, apple slices, which would turn brown by the time that I got to them. Always whole grain brown breads. And we were never allowed to have soda or sugar in the house.
Right. I mean, at the time, it sounded like a terrible privation. But in fact, every once in a while, my daughters will post the stuff that they put in their kids' lunches, and they sound very much like the lunches that your mother served.
I know. So what was very different back then, I think, is very standard right now.
Yeah.
My mother's mother was one of 13. She grew up on a farm in New Hampshire. What my grandmother gave me there was really a connection to where was your food coming from?
Yeah.
She had her egg guy. She would go to the egg farm to get the eggs. She was not going to buy eggs from a grocery store. If she bought meat, it was from the one butcher that she trusted. She knew where the meat was coming from. She wouldn't even serve us brown bread because she would never buy bread that was pre-made. Everything had to be by scratch.
Mm-hmm. That she made.
That's the way that they grew up on the farm.
Mm-hmm. Was the farm in Connecticut?
New Hampshire. It was in New Hampshire. It was nothing that I saw. It was her father's farm, so it was long gone by the time that I was a kid. But it certainly shaped, how she ate and what she did in her own home.
Right. It's always interesting to me how, particularly with food, but any number of cultural phenomena, that food goes in cycles. Mm-hmm. And that we're obviously in a much more healthy cycle now than we've been in a long time. Still not just in terms of the general population. We'll get into this, I think, a little bit later. But how a number of people that I talk to on the podcast will talk about, a grandmother who had a garden. Mm-hmm. Or the family garden that they grew up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There was literally food to table. Mm-hmm. There was no intermediary. And interestingly, too, that when I lived a lot in the city, in New York City, when I would go out to go shopping, I would go to an egg purveyor. I would go to a butcher. I would go to it wasn't one-stop shopping.
Yeah. Yeah. And the culture drastically changed. We were, until sometime around the 1950s, maybe 1940s, we were all very connected to our food. If you think about the history of Greenwich, Connecticut, it was a farming community. There was a large farm here. We've never been this separated from our food before. And it's not a good it's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem, particularly in the Northeast, with how expensive land is. But we've never been this disconnected. And I think that people naturally are getting back to this desire to have a connection with their food and to have more control over it because it has gotten so absurd.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to get into that a little bit more just in terms of general nutrition culturally. But for the moment, I want to still stay with your childhood. So then here you are in a household where your mom primarily, right? Dad didn't cook at all?
So my father's side of the family is another extreme. So he comes from a very old American family, literally, 9 of my ancestors on the Mayflower and many behind, here since the very beginning were masons and engineers and really served the community from the very beginning.
Right.
My grandmother was born in a home in which the kitchen was shut. You were not allowed in the kitchen. There was a cook in the kitchen and the children were not allowed in. So she couldn't even see it or experience what was going on behind the door. Her father also had a farm that was close to the house, and I know that they enjoyed a lot of fresh food, but literally there was a wall and a barrier for her. There was no way for her to experience the kitchen.
Right.
And then she found herself she was very educated. She went to Cornell, the same undergraduate university that I did. That's where my grandparents met. She found herself with 5 kids in Greenwich, Connecticut. And I think that she bought hook, line, and sinker, the 1950s philosophy of don't waste your time, women, in the kitchen. Exactly. That is not something that you need to concern yourself with. Buy the TV dinner. And so my father had a very uninspired food experience as a child. It was, TV dinners. And,
Right.
I asked him this morning, Dad, what do you think? What foods come to mind in your childhood? He's like, oh, spam. Like, oh, that's just...
I've talked about this a couple of times before, but my brother, who was a gourmet cook and had like 400 cookbooks and loved to cook, he rediscovered spam at one point later in his life and started including it in recipes and loved it.
I'm sure there's a nostalgia.
Yeah.
She was busy, but she also, loved her life. It meant that she could play 2 rounds of golf in the summer, come home and have a martini and, didn't have to worry so much about dinner. And that was her experience. There are very few food. I don't really remember. I mean, I think that there was it's as awful as it is, like a Jell-O mold that she used to make, I think, in the summer. I mean, just awful. And food wasn't something that I think she could appreciate it for sure, but she didn't value it the way that my mother's side of the family did.
Right. How many siblings?
I have 2 sisters.
2 sisters. Okay. So there were 5 of you. Did you guys go out at all?
Oh, no, just 3 of us. So 3 of us. My dad was one of 5. Not when we were little. As we grew up, we went out a lot, but not as a child. We ate at home.
Well, I'm including in all this the teenage years as well.
When we got into our teenage years, we did. We went out as a family.
Were there special places?
There was a place in upstate. They would be special outings, right? For birthdays and such. There was this amazing place in upstate New York. It was called Harold's. I want to say it had like a Michelin star. It was the most special place. Harold and his wife ran it. They had a trout pond out front. And so if you ordered trout, they would pull the trout out of the pond. And everything written on a chalkboard, what was being served that night. It was always different. And it was just this absolute passion of Harold and his wife. But it was just this small but spectacular experience because of the love and the thought and the care, just the care of these two people, how much they loved this food and put that onto a plate for you.
Despite the fact that you were a teenager, I'm not commenting on your character as a teenager, because I think most teenagers are sort of oblivious to that sort of thing. It made an impression.
Oh yeah. No, I've always loved food and appreciated food. Yeah. No, those were special experiences for me.
Yeah. What was the chatter around the dinner table like when you were a kid?
I just remember the feeling of like warmth around the table. At home, it was a very casual experience. We were generally eating at the table in the kitchen, and we never had formal dinners. That was only for Thanksgiving or, some special thing. And so our meals were always casual. And often, back in those days, my dad commuted to the city. So we were often eating before dad was home. And something was put away for him. And so generally it was just the girls around the table.
Right.
And we were talking about things that were very practical. I played a lot of sports. We'd talk about games, schedules.
Right.
So I more remember the warmth around the table.
There are times when I've spoken to people about their experience around the dinner table, and often it was not warm. I've spoken to any number of the folks who have done podcasts with me. Remember, I actually, one specific thing, Michael Patrick King, who talked about the fact that the food at the table was so bland and so awful that the only thing that flavored it were the tears that his mother dribbled into the food when she was making it, because she hated cooking so much.
Well, my father might have those stories, although my grandmother would never cry over it. He had a saying in his family when he was growing up: "Moose shit, but good." that it didn't matter how awful the thing was that she served. You better smile. If it was moose shit, you say moose shit, but good, Mom. Never complain, because at least it was something. And if you complained, you were going to get nothing tomorrow.
Right.
So.
How about school? What was the school food like when you were growing up? That is, I know you took the healthy lunches with you.
When I got to high school, I was a jock. I played 3 sports. I was hungry, So
right.
I went to Greenwich High School. I went to the public school in Greenwich, and we had a pretty decent cafeteria. We had a couple of separate areas to eat and choices. And then we had this Italian deli that's still open and right around the corner from the high school. And so once you hit junior year and you could drive your car to school, you were going to Rinaldi's for food, Right. And the family was there, and they were just warm, happy, wonderful, characters in our life that, would see you walk in the door and, would start making up your favorite, and so it was all about Rinaldi's. And I guess that was the beginning of my love of Italian food.
Would you consider that one of your awakenings as you grew up?
My big awakening, I think that there were a couple. So one, I don't totally understand. And that was somewhere around the age of 8, maybe. I told my mother that I would no longer eat meat. And I can't exactly tell you why. I didn't grow up in a vegetarian home. Clearly this was not, something that was popular. I didn't have any friends that were doing it. And she said, "Sarah, but you can't do that. You're going to not grow. I don't know how to do this for you." And that was it. I stopped eating meat. And I can't say it wasn't because I didn't like it, because those were some of my favorite foods until that time. It was just I think it was just you come into consciousness, and I could understand what this was. And I realized that, well, it was really quite practical. Well, if I could make a choice to eat a meal and it didn't involve, killing an animal, then then why not? I'll make this other choice.
So this was an ethical
I think at
choice?
first it was an ethical choice, but I wasn't standing on a soapbox, saying, talking about it. I choose to eat other foods.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that my mother really knew how to do that. Vegetarianism was not common.
Right.
There weren't a lot of options, and she didn't know how to cook them.
Obviously, at some point, with this extraordinary resume that you have in science, where did this interest in science come from?
So I think that there was part of it that was just inherently me. From the time that I have a memory. So sometime around kindergarten, maybe first grade, but I think kindergarten, as my parents told me the story, the school came to them and said, your child is very good at science and math, let's say, or the analytics and math.
Right.
And should either skip grades or should be in sort of advanced classes. And so from the time that I remember, I was in advanced classes. My mother didn't want me to skip grades because of the social aspects. I was already young for my class. I was already very young for my class to begin with. So I think I'm naturally inclined to those kinds of subjects. And that sort of runs in my family. Many engineers on my grandmother's side, on my father's other side, my Swiss family. My great grandfather was a chemist. He was a PhD. So lots of engineers. One of my uncles was one of the city planners of Manhattan. So things like that. One of my uncles was a founding member of NASA.
Yeah.
I think that we're just inclined to be scientific. And then the other thing that really informed me, that really changed, I think, or altered my path in a way as a child, was that my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer at 39. And she took an interest very much in how diet could help her in her journey there. So food was very important to me before that. And I had already made choices about food and health for myself. But then we kind of went on the journey together. And I couldn't have done that myself because I couldn't drive. We had to go to, we had to drive far distances to find an organic market. There wasn't access to these kinds of things when I was a kid.
And she was obviously at the time, and early for the time, I'm assuming, cognizant of the fact that there were things about organic food that were healthier than the diet that she had been following.
Yeah. So at the time, they thought of this, the term for it was more macrobiotic. Right.
I have friends who've had breast cancer and breast cancer surgery who follow macrobiotic diets very strictly.
So it's many of the things I think we think about as a whole food diet now. It's really getting away from processed foods.
Yeah. Eating
whole foods, whole plants, whole grains. But she also got interested more in fermented foods. I mean, at the time when I was growing up, even the Japanese food and Japanese culture was still hard to find. Getting miso soup,
right?
And she would incorporate mushrooms a lot into her cooking. But these were things you had to seek out a lot more than now. You can go into any grocery store and get many of these foods, which is wonderful.
Where did your interest in nutrition, did it start with your mom?
So I went to Cornell and I studied in the School of Agriculture. So I was a biology major in the School of Agriculture. And I have to say, I still draw from those experiences. And because whether it was, a lecture that I caught or agricultural economics, that I took when I was there. They were, this was growing, and food source was such a topic. And again, so ahead of the time. And so planting seeds in my mind around, okay, well, of course it makes sense to eat organic and to not want your food bathed in pesticide, right? Like that's just kind of intuitive. But my experience there was like, it's not just about your health. It's also mostly about the health of the farmer who's being exposed at great quantity to many of those things, right? So even if we even if we couldn't quantify, or we didn't have the data to say, here's exactly what eating organic will do for your health, it was certainly really clear that it would have a massive impact on the health of the person growing the food, who is so close to putting the pesticide on the soil, and then the people who were agricultural workers who, again, had so many exposures. My experiences there really, again, I still draw from them. They were very important.
What I'm interested in is just the genesis of, first of all, you come out of high school with a broad sort of scientific background, right? What informed the decision to narrow it down to
biology? So first it was biology. And that was really, I was in love with physics, to be honest, in high school. And I didn't take biology in high school. So I took AP chemistry, I took AP physics, and just loved science and loved physics, and really thought that I might want to be a physics major.
I envy you. In high school, I loved physics, but I hated chemistry.
Oh, really?
The only bad grade I ever made in my life.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I have a daughter who was a chem major in college.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, so please continue.
And then I was exposed to biology. I wasn't sure coming in that I was going to be a bio major, but as soon as I was exposed to biology, I thought, wait, this is kind of amazing. A field in which I could be analytical and go through the sort of the scientific logic, but it had direct human application. I'm like, this is amazing. Because with physics, it's so cool. It is so cool, but it's so abstract. And so the thought of being able to study a science that had direct implications for humans, that was, then I was sold. And then that was it. I actually ended up doing research at Columbia as part of my undergrad, my time as an undergrad. We didn't have a medical school up on main campus. And so I ended up doing research with a physician at Columbia Medical School. And that research was in lipid metabolism and nutrition. So really, I became fascinated with studying nutrition from really every aspect that I could imagine.
Where did medical school come in?
So what was going on the personal side of this journey was that Mom was diagnosed with breast cancer at 39. It recurred. And so it was about my senior year of college that she was diagnosed as terminal. She had metastases. And so that was the time I took. I was taking care of my mother while she was terminal, and much of my graduate experience. And Mom passed away. I wrote my dissertation, and I was married at the time, and my husband looked at me and he said, I really want to start a business with my father. And, now's the time. You spend time with your family, right? Well, they're here and they're active, and that sounds like a great idea. And he's like, in Cleveland. I'm like, okay. Okay. And I really, I grew up outside of Manhattan. We were living in Manhattan, and we packed up the car and went to Cleveland.
Went to Cleveland.
And I really couldn't complain because there was amazing medical training. I graduated from Case. I spent half of my clinical time at the Cleveland Clinic. I did a fellowship in cardiovascular genetics there. I mean, it was an amazing, amazing place to learn medicine.
So the move was fortuitous.
The move was fortuitous. And it was.
And did it seem a natural progression to go from your early research directly into medical school, from your master's degrees and PhD in nutrition?
If everything in my life weren't going on, I likely would have just gone right to medical school, but that wasn't practical. I mean, just the amount of time, concentration, hours that it takes. I couldn't do that and take care of my mother at the same time. Mm-hmm. So there was I wanted to do both my scientific training and my medical training. It worked out in that order. But yeah, it was natural and unnatural at the same time, because I was a little bit older, had finished a doctoral degree. I think I was able to get maybe more out of it because I had that background, but at times it was not as easy, as having just come out of undergrad and gone through that course.
And you told me a story once when you and I were talking in your office that has stuck with me, and that is your experience as a medical student vis-a-vis the sartorial behavior of other women who were in medical school as opposed to the way you dressed.
Oh, this was much later. This was much later. So
wasn't it med school?
So I went through internal medicine and then cardiology training. So I'm a trained cardiologist. And the last that I checked, maybe it's changed in the last year or two, but the last time that I checked, and certainly when I was going into it, only 15% of the incoming fellows were female. So the highly male field.
Yeah.
It is tough training. It's grueling. It should be. Everything's an emergency. You have to make very quick decisions. You train in the cath lab. There's a lot of radiation exposure, during that time. So, and those are, so perhaps that's one of the reasons why there aren't as many women during their, childbearing years who choose to go into cardiology. I'm not sure if that's, part of it, but it's tough. It's tough training. So fewer women. And I know that this sounds strange, but I had to make a decision in my career as to whether I was going to be feminine, whether I was going to maintain my female traits, because I think in any hard field like that, and perhaps women in banking feel the same way, or women in the military feel the same way. But, when you're in a tough training environment as a woman, it is male characteristics that often take over.
Yes.
Right. And,
and they are often traditionally male dominated fields.
Yeah.
Fields that we normally associate with tough decision making, a kind of, for want of a better word, kind of test pilot mentality of, damn the torpedoes in full speed ahead. As you were just saying, you have to make decisions very quickly, very immediately. Yeah. Surgeons often that have that same reputation, and the field tends to be, or at least has been in the past, much narrower in terms of masculine and feminine.
Right. And so I think that there is a culture of, if I talk hard, if I am harsh, if I talk fast.
Yeah. If I'm tough,
then I know what I'm doing, and I am a good doctor. I had to make a decision as to whether I was going to kind of keep my femininity and be that doctor.
Right. And I think, excuse me for interrupting, but I think that also what you're saying is that it's not just about the way you look. Mm-hmm. It's also about what women bring to medicine.
Yeah.
Which is empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
In concert with the ability to deal with emergency situations.
Yeah, and I very clearly made the decision to be feminine, to be a woman. I had 4 children during my medical training.
Looking back on it, how? How did you do it?
Honestly, I don't know. I don't know. It was very, very hard.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was very hard. It's a whole other topic of
Okay.
no, that's a whole other topic of interest of how
Right.
women, dedicated female doctors, get through it and all of the things that they need to do. It's not easy. It just isn't easy.
Yeah.
But that was a very important decision, and I've stuck to it, and I have to remind myself of that every day, because it is a lot easier to be hard, and when you are slower, when you're kinder, it allows moments with patients for them to tell you things that are important about their health.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes that gets in the way of an appointment ending on time or something, getting done quickly, but very important for a patient's overall health. And so that's what I saw as I went through the hospital,
And the operative word there is overall health.
Yeah, overall health.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's really a lot of the things that brought me back to primary care, is having gone through all of that training and seen so much end stage disease. I would say to myself all the time, oh my goodness, if only I had met them 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back to the beginning in primary care is really where you can stop the process from happening. It's hard at the end of it,
Right.
to try
Right.
to go.
Right. When you're dealing not just with symptoms and with outcome, but you're also dealing with prevention.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. I mean, that was one of the major questions I was going to ask you, is what led you, given the fact that you have this extraordinary training in cardiology,
Mhm.
that you decided to return to primary care.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a decision that many specialists choose to make, but it was very much driven by that. I really care about changing the course of the disease process and getting to root cause. And here I was with all of this training in nutrition and all of this care that I wanted to give. We were doing, a lot of heroic things in the hospital, but I wasn't, I really wanted to change the course for people. I didn't want them to get there. I didn't want them to get to the hospital. And I wanted the ability to use all of that knowledge on a day-to-day basis. We're not taught in medical training a whole lot about prevention. The medical system, unfortunately, currently is set up primarily to treat disease.
Right.
It's the way that we're compensated. You're compensated for procedures.
Mm-hmm.
We're not compensated. They're playing with some models to do this in certain settings right now. But in general, we're not paid to prevent disease. And so, that's how the system is set up now. And so in order to be able to have the time, and to talk to patients and also to really impact health, I think it needs to start at the level of primary care.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Well, speaking of prevention, from your point of view, what do you consider the healthiest diet?
I think that there are a lot of ways to eat a healthy diet. I think that there are certain things that we can all accept as truths, though.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say there are many healthy diets, certainly the things that you might eat in one area of the world are different from what we might eat in the United States and what is available to us, right? And
Right.
so while we can talk about specific foods as being healthy, that doesn't mean that you should go get it and ship it here, to eat it. But I think in general there are some very important principles, and one is to eat whole foods. Just whole foods. So avoid packaged, processed anything. If it doesn't look like a food in its whole form, then it should be something that's a staple of your diet, right?
The shorter the ingredient list is, the better.
Yeah. And the ingredient list should have nothing that you can't pronounce, nothing that you don't know. So an oat, right?
Yep.
Not an oat that's broken down and that has other ingredients and preservatives and other things, right? So just whole foods. And I know that sounds so simple, but it's incredibly important. So whole fruits, whole vegetables, whole grains, seeds, nuts, legumes, right? Those should be your foundation, the foundation of the diet.
Mm-hmm.
And in their whole form. Like I don't love juice because, juicing the fruit means that your body will metabolize it in a different way. Once you take out the fiber, and you can also drink something much more quickly than you can eat it, then you're going to get that sugar spike, right? So you can't even say that there's one food that is so healthy, because it's also the devil's in the details. How are you consuming the food? And where is that food from, right?
Mm-hmm. How is it prepared?
Yeah, and how is it grown? Mm-hmm. We have a lot of GMO seed that is Roundup ready in the United States.
Now, when you're talking about juicing, we'll separate that from things that you blend but that remain fibrous. That is, they keep their physical composition. They're just turned into a liquid.
Although I think that I think that there's a spectrum of healthy. I still think that most adults, unless the only way that you're going to get something into somebody is by juicing, for example, with kids, they're not gonna eat a fruit unless, you put it into a smoothie. So, in some ways, okay, well, that's maybe better than nothing. But for an adult human, still think about a smoothie. If you took the components of the smoothie and put them in a bowl, you'd probably eat about half of it. And versus drinking the smoothie, it's gone in 30 seconds?
Yep.
So I still think in an absolutely ideal world where you're like crossing the T's and dotting the I's on somebody's health, chew your food. Right? Because that is part of the natural process of digestion. Digestion begins in the mouth. It actually begins before that. It begins with the nose. You smell, right? Yep. Your body begins to get ready for food when you smell the food. And then, and then the mouth and the taste buds. Okay, is it a sweet food? It's already preparing your stomach for what's to come. So I think the ideal is to chew your food.
Right. And also, I think probably obviously, and I'm sure a lot of my listeners know this, that there's a big difference between foods that have healthy fiber in them and foods where we're back to whole foods, where the fiber hasn't been extracted.
Yeah, absolutely. And again,
and that goes through the whole digestive tract.
Exactly. And look, if that smoothie or the juice means that you're going to get greens and otherwise you wouldn't be consuming them, then by all means, that's great. Getting healthy food into your body is important. So I don't want to say, that's absolutely bad, but I think that all of food is just a spectrum of bad to good, right? There's no absolutes. Is eating the fruit better than drinking the fruit? Yes. Right? But is that still better than Coca-Cola? Yes.
Yes.
So it's a spectrum of choices.
Right.
I always use the example of water, because people come into the office, they're like, is it good for me or is it bad for me? Everything's good for you and bad for you. Take water. We can all agree it's good for you, right? Water is good. But Every physician has seen somebody die in the hospital from over-consuming water.
Oh, really?
There are certain medications that cause you to drink a lot of water. You can drink yourself to death with water, right? Hyponatremia can kill you.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that is good can be bad at quantity, right? So everything is about a moderation.
Moderation, right. And what about the relationship of diet and weight gain? Because I know a lot of people are confused by any number of different claims about whether carbohydrates are bad for you, whether whatever food contributes to weight gain and or weight loss. What's the overall kind of best advice for people in terms of weight loss? Because I'm sure that more people are looking for weight loss than they are for weight gain.
Yeah, so it's a good question. It gets to, I think, something that's very fundamental in nutrition, that when you're asking about what is healthiest, there's the health, let's say there's the healthiest diet for long life, for overall nutrition, right? But there are certain diets that will help you lose weight faster that maybe aren't good for you in the long run, right? And so I think it's tricky when we talk about weight loss, because some people want it quick, fast, and now.
Right. Which is what most of the advertising.
Yeah. And so, if you want to drop 5 pounds quickly, there's certainly diets that do that, but that's not what I advise my patients to do. I think we have to be concerned about the long term as primary care physicians. I know it can be important to fit into a dress, but I really want people to get into healthy eating habits for their whole life. So if we have two dietary choices that can both result in not gaining weight, let's choose the one that's better for your overall health in the long run, right? And so for what I recommend, and I'm not a one size fits all kind of diet, I don't give that kind of advice. I think you get to know the person, get to know their dietary preferences, get to know their history, what's worked for them in the past, and then you try to make their diet just a little bit better, a little bit more high quality. Overall, eating whole food, so getting away from anything processed, right? Because you think about a processed grain, okay? All of the fiber and nutrient is on the outside of the grain, right? If you think about like a brown rice or. And once you strip that fiber and micronutrient off, what's in the center is something white, and it's something very close to sugar. And in fact, it starts in your mouth. When you have a simple carbohydrate, it begins to break down to sugar. And by the time that it hits your stomach, it's pretty much sugar, right? And so then you get a spike of glucose. Versus were you to eat the whole grain, your stomach, your body has to work on that exterior nugget and the fiber and slowly getting the sugar out. And so instead of this, I have to look at where the camera is. It's more of something like that. And those sugar spikes lead to more hunger, more insulin that's needed, to tamp down the glucose. So in general, eating whole foods will take care of those glucose spikes. And then the other part of it is that the fiber goes down to the lower part of your gut where these little microbes live. They're we can't digest that, but that's what they live off of. And so it's really supporting the flora in your gut that have all kinds of health benefits, Affects your mood, protection from viruses, bacteria, inflammation. That's their little environment, and they're little frontline fighters. Lots of health benefits of having fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, fibrous plant material as the base of your diet.
Right.
That gives you complete protein. And when you're choosing plant foods for protein over animal proteins have none. So if you take like the standard American diet, which is kind of meat and cheese in the morning and meat and cheese for lunch and meat and cheese for dinner, and it's like egg and cheese with processed meat, bacon, that's breakfast. Lunch might be a burger with cheese and a processed bun, and dinner being some kind of, steak with, I don't know, maybe there's a veggie in there, like broccoli with some cheese on it. I don't know. But anyway, when you think about that kind of standard American diet, that has almost no fiber, right? Very little fiber. So those are the choices, I think.
Right. And obviously it follows that then whatever the healthiest diet is, whatever the best diet is also one that will contribute to a healthier lifespan.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. So
longevity.
When you and many studied, long-lived kind of cultures. Of course, the blue zones, they're books that have looked at this. They may have very different ingredients to their diet, but the one thing that is very similar is that what is consumed day to day is very high in plant matter and very minimal in animal matter, particularly meat. That's more of a rare sort of celebration than a staple. Yes. There is some fermented dairy in those diets, like yogurts, goat yogurts and such. Meat and animal products are not the staple. The staple is plant matter.
Yes. That when you talk about what we consider to be the traditional American diet, meat and potatoes, the first word is meat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, meat with a side of meat.
Meat with a side of meat, and also with a side of, if it's a regular potato, that has very little fiber in it, as opposed to sweet potatoes.
They're generally, or they're fried.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. I've got one final question that I always ask everybody. If there's one food from when you were a kid, from when you were young, not necessarily a small child, but somewhere in your life between the time you were aware of food and the time when you were an adult, that comes to mind, that evokes some sort of a memory, that gives you a real sort of flashback, reminiscence of a time in your life, of people or a certain person in your life, a particular event in your life. Is there one particular food memory that you have from that time in your life that sort of stands out?
Well, I'll tell you about something that we do now that makes everything sort of come full circle for me. So now I have 4 kids, and one thing that we love that I think just makes us all really happy is my children have learned to make their own pizza dough, which is taken very seriously in our home and in many other homes, how to make the right dough out of just a few ingredients. And we get our flour and our tomatoes from Italy, and we care very much about, and our olive oil from a lovely couple in Italy who sends us fresh batches of olive oil.
Oh, wow.
And we all gather around and we make dough either the morning before or the night before with wonderful ingredients. And we have a pizza oven and we make pizza together. I didn't get to tell you about this, but we have bees we have a beehive here. We have an apiary at our home.
Oh, how wonderful.
The kids take honey from our bees, and with the crust of the pizza, they dip the crust into the honey. Oh. It's like this just wonderful tradition, just that brings us together. There's very little, I mean, this is minimal. Most of it is, this wonderful flour and fresh tomatoes, and a very light kind of pizza with basil on it and a little bit of olive oil. But it's an amazing experience doing that with the kids, and to see their love of food and their attention to food and how they treat the dough, and depending on the temperature and the time of year, and making it better and better. And then we'll go out to local pizza places, the city or around town, and try to figure out if they have a good dough, exactly how they make it. So,
but essentially what you're describing is the kind of transformation and creation of community that food affords all of us. Particularly when we share it and when we prepare it together.
Exactly. I mean, it's a very wonderful healing experience to sit around a table or to be in a kitchen with people that you love. Yeah. And creating a meal, a nutritious meal. It's what we were supposed to do and to be. And I think that it is absolutely essential for our happiness. I mean, until recently, as humans, just the human animal, we spent most of our day finding and making food. Yeah. And I think there's no question, it's our separation from that process that leads to unhappiness, and getting back to that.
And ill health.
And ill health, and getting back to it. It's not only better for our bodies, but also better for our beings, our psyche. We need to connect as humans. We need connection. We need community. We need to put good, wholesome food into our bodies. And that's just it's gotten so hard.
Well, in some ways so hard, but also it's gotten in some ways easier, in the sense that we're now, at least in terms of the culture, aware of the fact that we have sources for it, and that we have access to better food. We have access to also the philosophy that this is an important factor in not only our emotional health, that physical health, but our emotional health. And I can't think of a better way to end the podcast today than to thank you, Dr. Sara Seidelmann.
Thanks for having me. It was fun to talk.
It's been really a lovely and wonderful experience, and I thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
For helping us to get back to an idea of the fact that we all cook by heart.
Yes, we do. All right. Take care.
Thank you, Sarah.